Sometimes the deepest mysteries are written not in ink, but in silence. A letter never sent, a name never spoken, and a love so fierce it chose to vanish rather than wound. Tonight's story is about the truths we protect and the cost of keeping them buried. Where in the world are you tuning in from? What time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments. Let's begin the story. The friend who never called back. The envelope had yellowed slightly at the edges, its once crisp fold now softened by time. Jessica held it carefully between her fingers, the familiar handwriting looping across the front, like a memory she wasn't quite ready to let go of. Helen Markham. It had been years since Jessica had spoken her name aloud, though the memory of her voice remained curiously intact. Quiet, musical, tinged with something always just out of reach. The letter had arrived in March, a surprise among the usual flyers and local newsletters. It was short, even tentative, an invitation to visit Gull's Reach, with little more than a date, a line about wanting to reconnect, and Helen's signature at the bottom, firm yet somehow reluctant. But after that, nothing. Jessica had replied, of course. A warm note, gracious and curious, asking about Helen's life and confirming the date. No answer came, no phone call, no second letter. The silence lingered like perfume on an old scarf, fragrant but fading. She had meant to follow up, but spring had passed, then summer, and the quiet between them became harder to bridge. Now, months later, she found herself returning to the letter, not as correspondence but as a question. Why invite her at all, only to disappear? It didn't feel like carelessness, it felt deliberate. She folded the letter and slid it back into her bag, her expression thoughtful. Some invitations arrived late, others were never meant to be answered at all. Jessica placed a soft linen blouse into her suitcase, smoothing the fabric as if gentling a memory. Her movements were practiced, efficient, but her thoughts drifted freely. Helen Markham. In college she'd been luminous, graceful, unreadable, always trailing the scent of something poetic and unfinished. They'd shared poems, secrets, the quiet hours between lectures. Jessica had admired her brilliance, though it had often come laced with shadows. Their friendship had faded after graduation, not out of conflict but distance. Helen had chosen the solitude of a coastal town, Jessica the rhythm of classrooms, and later manuscripts. Over the years there were birthday cards, rare notes, but the intimacy had dulled into something ceremonial. Still, that letter, there had been a tone in it, a flicker of the Helen Jessica remembered, touched with vulnerability. I've been thinking of you, would you consider visiting? I'm not sure why now, but I'd like to see you. Jessica zipped the suitcase slowly, her mind returning to the line that had lingered longest. I'm not sure why now. What had prompted that sudden urge? Had Helen sensed something, feared something? There were questions ink couldn't answer, but perhaps Gull's Reach could. The drive to Gull's Reach was long, winding along the eastern coastline like a memory refusing to straighten. Jessica welcomed its quiet. The ocean revealed itself in glimpses, blue-gray and restless, while the pines leaned like listeners over the narrow road. She remembered the last time she had come this way, decades ago, for a brief summer retreat. Even then, the town had felt tucked away from the world, resistant to the speed of modern life. Its name had always felt poetic to her, Gull's Reach, not a place so much as a promise of something distant, just beyond. As she passed the weather-worn sign at the town's edge, a sense of stillness wrapped around her like sea fog. The houses perched along the cliffs seemed older now, less curious, their windows either closed or blankly staring. There were few people on the streets, and fewer smiles. Jessica parked outside the small inn on Larkin Hill. The The proprietor greeted her with polite disinterest, and the room she was given smelled faintly of salt and lavender sachets. She unpacked in silence, gazing briefly out the window. Helen had lived just a short walk away. The air felt heavier here, as if waiting for something to be said. The house on Weymouth Lane stood at the end of a gently sloped path, half hidden behind a low stone wall and a veil of overgrown wisteria. Jessica paused at the gate, uncertain whether to knock or simply walk away. The windows were shuttered. The garden, once likely lovely, had surrendered to weeds and silence. She opened the gate. It creaked, not loudly, but with a kind of reluctance, as if unused to visitors. There was no answer at the door. Jessica waited a moment longer, then circled toward the side of the house. Curtains were drawn across every window, and no sign of life stirred within. A wind picked up, rustling the ivy against the shutters like fingers along a locked drawer. She stood for another few minutes, then stepped back, unsettled. Something wasn't right. Even the silence felt performed. On her way back to the street, she noticed a worn blue ceramic planter near the steps, its soil dry, its geraniums long withered. But tucked beneath one broken leaf was a sealed envelope, damp at the corner, unaddressed. Jessica left it untouched. For now, the house had been waiting, yes, but for whom? Across the lane, a curtain stirred. Jessica turned, offering a gentle wave. The curtain froze, then parted slightly. An older woman stepped onto her porch with a cautious smile. She wore a pale cardigan and held a teacup, though it seemed forgotten, in her hand. "Excuse me," Jessica said kindly. "I was hoping to visit Helen Markham. I received a letter from her a while back." The woman's expression shifted, just a flicker, but enough. "Helen?" she echoed, as if testing the name. "Yes, we were friends, years ago." The woman looked away. "She hasn't been well," she said vaguely. There was talk. Jessica waited, silently. The woman's gaze returned to her. "She doesn't live there now. Left some weeks ago, I think." Quietly, "That's what people are saying. Is she all right?" "I wouldn't know." Her tone had closed like a door. Jessica nodded with gentle understanding. "Thank you." As she turned away, she sensed the woman watching, teacup still full. It wasn't what she said, it was how carefully she hadn't said more. There were silences in Gull's reach that felt almost rehearsed. That evening, Jessica sat by the window of her inn, the sea murmuring softly below. Her notebook lay open before her, but the pen in her hand remained still. Helen's silence no longer felt accidental. There was a weight to it now, something unfinished, unsaid. She thought of the letter, of Helen's careful words, the fragile invitation, and then, nothing. Outside, a gull cried into the dusk, its voice lonely against the swell of the tide. Jessica closed the notebook, her hand lingering on its worn cover. A friendship lost to time was one thing, but this felt like a story interrupted. She looked once more toward the cliffside, where shadows gathered around the house with the drawn curtains. There was a reason Helen had never called back, and Jessica intended to find out what it was. The morning mist clung to the garden walls, like something unwilling to let go. Jessica returned to Helen's house just after breakfast, hoping daylight might offer a different answer than dusk had. It didn't. The shutters were still drawn, the path still weedy, but now something new lingered, a small arrangement of white roses wilting at the gate. Nestled between the blooms was a weathered card, its ink slightly blurred by dew. It read only, "In memory." Jessica stood in silence. The message said little, and yet far too much. She hadn't imagined the air of finality yesterday. Someone had died, and though no name was written, it didn't have to be. The door remained unanswered when she knocked. and the house held its silence like a sealed confession. The wind pressed against her coat, and she turned reluctantly away, the questions in her mind tightening like a knot. What had happened here? Why had no one told her? And why, of all times, had Helen reached out to her before, whatever this was? Answers were scarce in Gull's reach, but silence, it seemed, was abundant. The cafe was small and panelled in pine, warmed by the smell of coffee and cinnamon scones. Jessica stepped inside, brushing sea air from her coat. A handful of locals were scattered at tables, speaking in low tones or not at all. She approached the counter, where a young woman, no older than 20, stood wiping a mug with practiced distraction. Her name tag read Lily. "Could I trouble you for tea?" Jessica asked gently. Lily nodded and turned toward the kettle. "Here on holiday?" she asked, her voice careful but not unkind. "Not quite," Jessica said, watching her. "I came to see an old friend, Helen Markham." Tilly's hands paused mid-motion. A beat passed before she finished pouring. "Milk? Just lemon, thank you." The cup was placed before her in silence. Jessica stirred it once, then asked softly, "Do you know if she's still in town?" Lily hesitated. "You hadn't heard?" Jessica met her eyes, waiting. "She passed away 2 weeks ago," quietly. She lowered her voice further. "They said it was suicide." Jessica's hands remained still around the cup. "I see," she murmured. Lily leaned in slightly. "She was kind, lonely, I think, but something about it never sat right with me." Jessica nodded, though her gaze had drifted. Lonely people didn't always leave letters, and they didn't all plan their goodbyes. The bell above the door gave a tired jingle as Jessica stepped into the bookstore. It was cozy, lined with tall shelves and the scent of aged paper. A man behind the counter glanced up from a stack of receipts. "Morning," he said, with a nod that fell somewhere between polite and disinterested. "Are you Clay Rudd?" Jessica asked. He eyed her more carefully. "That's me. I was a friend of Helen Markham's." His fingers stilled on the ledger. "I see. I understand she passed recently." Clay gave a small shrug. "That's what they say. Did you know her well?" A pause. "Used to. Years back. She was private. Liked her space." Jessica studied him. His words were guarded, too measured, not evasive, but curated. "She mentioned you once, in a letter," she said gently. That startled him. "Really? Well, we hadn't spoken in a long while. Whatever she remembered, it wasn't recent." Jessica offered a kind smile, sensing a door he didn't want opened. "Thank you, sorry to trouble you." As she left, she noticed a poetry display missing Helen's work, and Clay watching her, not with curiosity, but calculation. The sheriff's office was functional, almost sterile, with framed photos of fishing tournaments on the walls and a faded map of the coastline behind the desk. Sergeant Len Brody looked up as Jessica entered, his uniform neat, expression unreadable. "Can I help you, ma'am?" "I'm Jessica Fletcher. I came to visit Helen Markham. I've since learned of her passing." Brody gave a single nod. "Unfortunate, we handled the case ourselves. No foul play suspected." "She was a dear friend," Jessica said calmly. "The news surprised me." "It surprised everyone," he replied, not unkindly, "but she'd been keeping to herself. Left a note apparently, neatly signed." "May I ask what it said?" Brody shook his head. "Family's business now. Next of kin's been notified." Jessica waited. "Who found her?" "Housekeeper. Audrey. Good woman. Shocked, like the rest of us. She didn't contact me." He gave her a long look. Maybe she didn't know how, or maybe Helen didn't want her to. Jessica let the silence settle before thanking him and turning to go. Something in Brody's voice suggested finality, but Jessica had long since learned that closure often arrived far too early and never stayed long. The wind had shifted by late afternoon, bringing with it the sharp scent of seaweed and something older, brine soaked deep into the stones. Jessica walked the path along the back of Helen's property, a thin trail that skirted the cliffside and led to a small wooden bench once mentioned in Helen's letters. The house loomed above, mute and withdrawn. Jessica paused near the rear steps where moss had overtaken the paving stones. An overturned watering can rested against the fence, and near it, a single gardening glove faded and stiff. Helen had lived here, and yet the house bore no trace of her. No laughter, no rhythm, no ongoing life, only absence. Jessica knelt beside a small weed-choked herb patch. There, nestled beneath a cluster of lavender, lay a broken ceramic marker, rosemary, for remembrance. She gently turned it in her hand, wondering how many things Helen had quietly tended before vanishing from them all. She rose slowly, glancing up at the attic window. The curtain fluttered slightly, from wind, perhaps, or something more. Helen had called her back, however briefly, and Jessica could not shake the feeling that the final chapter had been rewritten by someone else. The churchyard sloped gently toward the sea, its headstones dappled with lichen and thyme. Jessica lingered among the markers, reading names that had long since slipped from memory, until one voice called out softly behind her. "You were asking about Helen." She turned to find a woman in her 80s, dressed in mourning grey, and leaning on a cane carved with gulls. Her eyes were sharp, unsentimental. "I knew her," the woman said. "We all did. Not well, mind you, but long enough." Jessica nodded. "I was a friend, from years ago." The woman studied her. "Then you shouldn't." "No, she didn't go easily. Not in her mind." "You mean she was unwell?" "No. I mean, people forget what being watched does to a person. Being doubted." Jessica tilted her head. "Watched by whom?" The woman shook her head. "Not my place. But secrets in small towns don't stay secrets forever. They just sour." Before Jessica could ask more, the woman turned and shuffled away, her cane tapping unevenly over the stone path. The sea whispered in the silence that followed. Helen's death, it seemed, hadn't just ended a life, it had disturbed something carefully buried. The front door opened not with a creak, but a quiet click, as though the house itself had reluctantly yielded. Audrey stood in the doorway, her face pale and composed, her eyes betraying only the faintest hesitation. "I heard you asking about Helen," she said, voice steady but soft. "Would you like to come in for a moment?" Jessica inclined her head gently. "Only if it's not too much trouble." Inside, the air held the scent of old wood polish and the trace of lavender. It was not the scent of a lived-in home, but of something preserved. Audrey led her through the foyer without commentary, pausing briefly at a doorway lined with muted wallpaper and the outlines of sun-faded portraits. This was her study, Audrey said. She spent most mornings here. Jessica stepped over the threshold, her gaze moving with quiet reverence. The room felt paused, as though Helen had only stepped away for tea and might return at any moment. Audrey didn't linger. "Take your time," she murmured. "I'll be in the kitchen." Left alone, Jessica moved to the desk. The surface was neat, save for a closed leather notebook and a chipped fountain pen. Something in the stillness held its breath. Jessica's fingers hovered over the drawer's edge. It wasn't locked, an odd detail in a house where everything else seemed so precisely guarded. She pulled it open slowly. Inside lay a jumble of old postcards, envelopes, and writing paper. Some were neatly stacked, others, half tucked and creased, bore the faint scent of dried ink. A faded return address label caught her eye, her own. Jessica's breath caught, just slightly. She lifted the top envelope. Her name, in Helen's unmistakable cursive, was written with care. Postage affixed, not mailed. She thumbed through the pile. A second, a third, all stamped, all dated in the last year. A letter a month, more or less. Her pulse quickened, not with fear, but with a deeper kind of recognition. Helen had tried to reach her, over and over, and someone had stopped those letters from ever leaving. She glanced toward the kitchen, no sound. Audrey hadn't mentioned them. Had she even known? Returning to the drawer, Jessica found a fourth envelope, unsealed this time, its flap barely tucked in. The paper inside was folded carefully. She hesitated. Then, as gently as lifting a fragile petal, she opened it. The first line read, "Jess, I don't know who else to trust." Jessica sat down slowly, placing the first letter on her lap and reaching for the next. She read in silence, the words unfurling like a voice long withheld. "I kept thinking I'd see your name in the mailroom, or hear your voice on the line. I waited too long, didn't I?" The tone was affectionate, hesitant, threaded with warmth and regret. The letters began gently, filled with memories, poems, even small details about the weather in Gull's Reach. But then, as the months passed, a quiet urgency crept in. "There are things here I can't explain. People change when they think no one's watching, but someone always is." Another envelope held a longer piece, more rambling than the others, the handwriting slightly uneven. "Do you remember the walk along Bellevue Cliff? I thought about that day all week. The air felt the same, but I felt watched. I thought I saw someone near the garden, but when I turned, no one was there. Audrey says it's nothing, but I can't tell if she's trying to comfort me or manage me." Jessica set the page down, her eyes narrowing. Helen had not been well, or perhaps more accurately, had not felt safe. There were no replies, no signs the letters had ever been opened or acknowledged. The last was dated just a week before Helen's death, stamped, signed, and silent. Jessica reached again for the final letter, her fingertips brushing the edge as if wary of what she might find inside. Helen's handwriting had grown looser, less restrained. "I can't be certain anymore who I can trust. I think Audrey suspects what I've been writing. I moved the pages yesterday, just in case. If anything happens to me, Jess, you'll understand why." There was no drama in the words, only exhaustion. Helen's voice, even on the page, carried its usual restraint, but beneath it, Jessica sensed something more alarming. Not desperation exactly, but resolve. "They'll say it was sadness, that I was tired. I was, but not in the way they'll think. I'm tired of hiding pieces of myself, of letting others decide what should remain buried." Jessica folded the letter carefully, her thoughts rippling outward. If these letters had reached her, would Helen still be alive, or had someone intercepted them precisely because they might have changed something? She stared at the ink, one word slightly smudged, likely from a tear or an unsteady hand. The silence after Helen's invitation wasn't neglect. It had been the beginning of something much heavier, a fear not named outright, but witnessed letter by letter. And now read too late. Jessica rose slowly, returning the last letter to its envelope, her heart heavier now with more than just sorrow. She placed the stack gently on the desk, her eyes tracing their neat arrangement one final time. A sound, light, almost imperceptible, drew her gaze toward the staircase just beyond the doorway. Audrey stood there, one hand resting on the banister, the other holding a small towel. Her eyes flicked briefly to the desk, then to Jessica. The glance was brief, but it carried weight. "I didn't mean to startle you," Audrey said, stepping down. "I was just finishing up upstairs." Jessica offered a calm nod. "You keep the house beautifully." Audrey smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you." Helen liked things tidy, even near the end. Jessica noted the use of past tense. It was the first time Audrey had acknowledged it aloud. "I should let you get on," Audrey added. "I imagine you have other places to be." Jessica hesitated, then gathered her coat and nodded. As she stepped toward the door, she glanced once more at the study, at the drawer now quietly closed, and Audrey still watching, her towel clutched just a bit too tightly. Back at the inn, Jessica sat in the armchair near the window, the ocean a grey smear beyond the glass. The letters rested in her lap, unread now but imprinted on her thoughts. Helen's words had been full of longing, but also fear. She had tried to reach out again and again, and someone had silenced her, not with threats or violence, but through omission. It was almost more chilling. Jessica opened her notebook and began to jot, not with her usual structured clarity, but in phrases, impressions. Audrey knows more, calm but controlled, glances at desk, letters all dated, none sent, mail interference. By whom? Helen's tone shifts, warmth uncertain, dread. Why? She paused, staring at the ink, then wrote one final line. Did someone want her to feel alone? Outside, a gull cried sharply above the cliffs. Jessica leaned back, the weight of the mystery beginning to press more firmly against her sense of calm. Something had been hidden, not buried, but quietly folded away, and Helen had been trying, in her own way, to send a message across the distance. Jessica only hoped she wasn't too late to finish reading it. Jessica stood once more before the familiar gate, the white roses at its base now browning at the edges. Morning sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting soft shadows on the path. She knocked gently, unsure if she would be welcomed a second time. The door opened part way, revealing Audrey in a dark cardigan, sleeves pushed to her elbows. Her expression was guarded. "Oh," she said, her tone flat. "Mrs. Fletcher." "I was hoping to speak with you again," Jessica said with gentle warmth. "If you have a few minutes." Audrey hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the door. "About Helen?" Jessica offered a small nod. "She's gone, you know. Talking won't bring her back." "No," Jessica agreed quietly. "But sometimes, remembering her helps us understand what she left behind." Another pause, heavy with thought. Then Audrey stepped aside. 5 minutes. Jessica entered. The air inside was still, not musty but sealed, like a room that had been closed to emotion. Audrey led her toward the sitting room, her steps brisk and tight. She never liked visitors, not even in life. Jessica smiled faintly. "And yet she invited me." Audrey didn't respond, but Jessica noticed the way her shoulders stiffened. The sitting room remained as Jessica remembered it, neat, curated, but strangely impersonal, as though Helen had lived beside her possessions rather than within them. Audrey sat across from her, hands folded in her lap, gaze turned toward the fireplace where no fire had been lit for weeks. "I was with Miss Markham for 16 years, she said after a long silence. "Housekeeper, companion, cook, whatever was needed." "You must have known her well," Jessica offered. Audrey gave a soft huff. "As well as anyone could. She wasn't easy to know, thoughtful, gentle, but always somewhere else." Jessica nodded, her eyes steady. "I remember that quality in her. She had a mind that wandered. Especially in the last year." Audrey's voice softened. She became more withdrawn, stopped answering letters, even from people she cared about. "Did she ever mention feeling unsafe?" Audrey hesitated. "No, not directly. She just tired easily. Her days got shorter. She spent more time upstairs, writing or napping. Said the outside world felt too loud." "And you?" Jessica asked. "Were you with her that final day?" "I was in and out." She had her routines. Tea at 10, letters in the afternoon. But she liked solitude. The edges of her reply felt rehearsed. Jessica tilted her head slightly. You mentioned tea at 10. Did she take it in the garden? Audrey shook her head. Not anymore. She stayed inside, mostly. And you? Were you here the morning she passed? Audrey looked up, her face composed. Yes, I had errands to run, but I was home early. Jessica let the pause stretch. That's interesting. Sergeant Brody mentioned finding the back gate unlatched. I assumed someone had gone walking. Audrey's gaze flickered. I didn't go out that way. You didn't take your usual walk to the market. I said I ran errands, not that morning. Jessica offered a kind smile, but her voice remained even. It's perfectly natural, Audrey. We forget details when we're grieving. Audrey looked down at her hands. I might have stepped out for a moment, yes, but only briefly. She was fine when I left. Jessica waited. She was reading in the parlor, Audrey added, with her glasses on, calm as ever. It was the certainty that troubled Jessica, the way the memory was told, not remembered. She didn't seem off, Jessica asked. No, Audrey said, too quickly. Not at all. But her fingers were tugging at her sleeve again, smoothing the same fold over and over. Jessica's gaze drifted toward the tea tray on the corner table, polished and untouched. Did Helen take her tea alone that day? She asked. Her voice soft but purposeful. Audrey blinked. She always did. Milk? Sugar? Both? Jessica walked to the tray. The teacup was empty, but faint rings suggested it had been used, then cleaned, perhaps hastily. A single spoon remained on the saucer, a faint smear of something pale along its edge. She usually finished it? Jessica asked, glancing back. Audrey nodded, but less certainly. Jessica touched the edge of the saucer. You said she was in the parlor when you left? Yes, and when you returned? Audrey hesitated. She was in her room. Jessica raised an eyebrow. So she moved. A beat. I assumed so. She often did. But you didn't see her move, Jessica said gently. No. Audrey's voice was quieter now. She wasn't in the parlor when I got back. Jessica let that sit a moment. And the tea? I don't know, Audrey whispered. Maybe she made another cup. Jessica walked slowly back to her chair. Was anything unusual about that morning? Audrey's answer came slower than before. She seemed tired, but not in pain. Jessica offered a small nod, but her mind lingered on the empty teacup and the space between Audrey's words. Jessica rose once more, drawn toward a shelf near the window where a small collection of books and framed photos stood in careful alignment. Most were family scenes, indistinct, sun-faded, but one stood out, a simple silver frame, faced downward. She hesitated, then gently turned it over. A younger Helen stood beside a man in his 30s, laughing, his arm draped casually across her shoulders. It wasn't posed, it was intimate. Who is this? Jessica asked, lifting the frame. Audrey turned sharply. That's no one, a friend from years ago. He looks familiar, Jessica said quietly. A relative. Audrey stepped forward quickly and took the photo from her hand. He was a guest. Briefly. He stayed here the summer Helen's sister came. Jessica watched the careful way Audrey placed the frame back, not upright, but face down again. She didn't like to dwell on the past, Audrey said firmly. Or to have others dwell on it, Jessica asked. Audrey didn't reply. Jessica softened her tone. It's all right to remember people, Audrey, even if it's complicated. It wasn't complicated, Audrey snapped, then blinked, as if startled by her own voice. The silence that followed was tense, brittle. Jessica folded her hands calmly, but inside she marked the moment. There were ghosts in Helen's house, and someone was still deciding which ones could be seen. Jessica stepped out into the crisp afternoon light, her coat pulled close against the wind rolling in from the cliffs. The air tasted of sea salt and lavender, but the house behind her clung to something colder. As she reached the gate, instinct tugged at her. Slowly she turned. A curtain on the second floor stirred slightly, then stilled. But it wasn't the movement that held her. It was the figure at the window, Audrey watching with an expression not of curiosity, but of calculation. Jessica raised her hand in farewell. Audrey didn't return the gesture. She simply remained there, eyes fixed, arms crossed. Jessica turned back toward the village, her steps deliberate. A loyal housekeeper, a silent woman, a changed routine, a face-down photograph. None of it amounted to proof, but in her bones, Jessica felt it. Someone inside that house was guarding more than grief. The door opened with a soft chime that felt more nostalgic than intentional. Jessica stepped inside, taking in the warm scent of paper and binding glue. The bookstore was the kind of place that wore its years with pride. Shelves slightly sagging, corners layered in dust motes, and titles filed more by memory than alphabet. A man behind the counter looked up from a worn ledger. He was in his early 60s, with silver threads at his temples, and the kind of hands that seemed more comfortable with books than people. "Good morning," Jessica said, smiling gently. "Morning," he replied, his voice gravel-worn but not unkind. The nameplate on the desk read Clay Rudd in handwritten calligraphy. "I heard this was the best bookshop in Gull's Reach." "Only one left," Clay replied, lips twitching in what passed for amusement. "That makes it both the best and the worst." Jessica chuckled politely. "I'm Jessica Fletcher. I was a friend of Helen Markham's." Clay stilled, just a second. But it was enough to shift the room's temperature. His hands closed the ledger. "Is that right?" "Yes. I was hoping to ask you a few things, if you have the time." "I suppose I do." Clay motioned to a stool near the counter, though he didn't sit himself. Jessica accepted the gesture, watching the careful way he resumed tidying a nearby stack of travel journals. "She was a gifted woman," Jessica offered. Clay gave a non-committal grunt. "Gifted? Yes. You knew her well." He paused again, an echo of hesitation, not quite defensiveness. "I knew her once. That was a long time ago." Jessica waited. Finally he added, "We were close. Briefly. It didn't last." "Why not?" "She needed something I couldn't give her." He looked up, "And I needed things she couldn't bear." There was no bitterness in his voice, only something quieter, deeper, a memory that had hardened at the edges. Jessica's tone remained soft. "And yet she wrote to me about you. As recently as a few months ago." That gave him pause. "Did she?" "Yes. Your name came up with affection. But also, distance." Clay let out a breath through his nose. Helen was many things, but she was never forgetful. If she stopped talking to someone, there was usually a reason. Jessica held his gaze. And if she tried to reach out? His eyes darkened. Then someone might have gotten in the way. Clay stepped behind the counter, as if the wooden surface could shield him from something old and unsettled. "She had a way with words," he said finally. "But not always a healthy one." Jessica leaned forward slightly. "You mean her poetry?" "I mean the way she wrote people. Sometimes without their knowing. Sometimes without kindness." Jessica considered that. "You felt exposed." Clay gave a dry laugh. "Once, years ago, she published a piece that described a man, nameless, but painfully familiar to anyone who knew us both. A man who was, let's say, not noble. And you?" "I was the man," he said simply. "And no, I wasn't noble, but I also wasn't cruel. Helen didn't always write what was true. She wrote what was beautiful, sometimes at the cost of truth. Jessica let the silence stretch. Did you confront her? I did. We stopped speaking after that. She moved deeper into herself. I built this place. His hand brushed the worn counter, as if reminding himself it was real. I never stopped reading her work, he admitted, and she never came back. But you were still in the same town. Same town, he said. Different orbit. Jessica made a note in her mind. There was affection in his voice, and injury. That particular combination often hid something else. She moved on, Jessica, Clay said, his tone quiet but firm. We both did. There wasn't much left to say. Jessica folded her hands, and yet she wrote letters that were never mailed. To me, about you, about this town. Clay stilled. I didn't know that. I found them in her study. He looked away as if her words had kicked up something sharp and unwanted. I hadn't spoken to Helen in over a decade, he said. Whatever she was writing, it didn't involve me. But you knew she was struggling. She always was, he said. Struggling, I mean, even when things looked peaceful on the outside. Helen had a way of wrapping silence around her fears. Jessica studied him. You cared for her still. Of course I did, he said. But love isn't always useful, is it? No, she replied gently. But it's rarely irrelevant. He looked at her then, not with challenge, but something quieter, resignation perhaps. Jessica let the moment settle before rising. Thank you, Clay. Truly, he gave a small nod but didn't speak. As she moved toward the back shelves, her thoughts stirred. There was more he hadn't said. She could feel it in the pauses. Jessica traced her fingers along the spine of a shelved anthology, feigning interest in the titles, as her voice remained casual. Clay, she said, over her shoulder, was Helen writing anything new recently? A memoir, perhaps? The question was light, but Clay's silence answered it before his voice did. A memoir, she hinted at something unfinished. Letters, reflections, a possible manuscript. Clay's tone flattened. Not that I know of. But if she were writing something, would you want to know? There was a pause. Depends on what it said. Jessica turned. Did you ever visit her in the months before she died? No. A beat. I thought about it once, then decided against it. Why? Clay looked at her directly now. Because people like Helen remember everything, every word, every silence. And I didn't want to become a chapter. Jessica smiled faintly. Perhaps you already were. His mouth twitched. That's the trouble with writers. And booksellers, Jessica added. We're both drawn to unfinished stories. Clay didn't reply, but she noticed the way his gaze drifted toward the side wall where the poetry collection stood. There was something absent there, and something unspoken still sat in the air between them. Jessica let her eyes move along the poetry shelf. The titles were familiar. Plath, Yeats, Dickinson, and then a gap, subtle but noticeable, between two slim volumes of modern verse. She ran a finger along the dust-lined space. Helen's collected letters, she said aloud, almost to herself. Wasn't it published 2 years ago? Clay didn't answer. She turned. His expression had grown distant. I thought you carried it. He cleared his throat. Sold out. Jessica tilted her head. Or removed. He didn't flinch, but he didn't confirm either. She stepped back, letting the silence speak for them both. Thank you again, she said. Soft and deliberate. You've been helpful. Clay nodded once. As Jessica exited the shop, the wind carried the scent of sea air behind her. But in her mind, the gap on the shelf lingered. not large enough to be accidental, and just wide enough to hold a missing truth. The afternoon air had thickened with coastal damp, and the hedges along Helen's gate leaned in as though to eavesdrop. Jessica stood with her gloved hands folded neatly, posture calm but mind alert. She rang the bell once. Audrey opened the door more slowly this time. "Mrs. Fletcher," she said, without invitation in her voice. "I'm so sorry to bother you again," Jessica replied, her voice warm. "I believe I left my reading glasses on the windowsill in Helen's study." Audrey blinked. "Did you?" Jessica smiled. "I often set things down when I'm deep in thought. They're quite dear to me." A pause. Then Audrey gave a stiff nod and stepped back. "Just don't move anything." "I wouldn't dream of it." Jessica entered the house with practiced softness. The stillness pressed close, as if even the walls remembered Helen's absence. The study hadn't changed, not visibly, and yet Jessica noticed now the way the air felt drier here. Stiller, books lined the shelves with the kind of precision that revealed a mind used to order. She glanced toward the window. No glasses, of course. She wasn't here for spectacles. She was here for something Helen had hidden in plain sight. Jessica moved slowly along the far wall of the study, her fingertips grazing the edges of the books. They were well kept, poetry collections mostly, arranged alphabetically, but not obsessively. Helen had been meticulous, but never rigid. A small volume by Bishop caught her attention, slightly misaligned, dust-free where its neighbors wore a fine layer. Curious, she pulled it forward. Behind it, something shifted. Jessica stepped back. A faint outline was visible. A panel, recessed half an inch deeper than the surrounding wood. Not obvious unless you were looking, unless you had reason to suspect someone had tampered with more than just letters. She crouched, gently nudging the row of books aside. With a quiet click, the panel gave. Behind it sat a shallow compartment, no more than 5 inches deep. Inside, stacked carefully and tied with twine, were 3 leather-bound notebooks. The paper edges were uneven, well thumbed, not archival. Jessica reached in, her breath held without knowing it. The top notebook had Helen's handwriting on the inside cover, "For Truth," or the closest thing to it. She closed the panel behind her, rose and carried the notebooks to the desk. Whatever Helen hadn't wanted others to read, Jessica would. Jessica untied the twine gently, as if unwrapping something alive. The first notebook crackled slightly as she opened it, the pages thick, hand-cut, the handwriting unmistakably Helen's. Slanted, elegant, with the occasional smudge that revealed thoughtfulness rather than haste. The title on the first page was modest, and yet jarring. "A Life Revised." Beneath it, a single line, written for no one, but kept because someone may ask. Jessica turned the pages slowly. The memoir wasn't organized in chapters, not formally, more like entries in a diary, though longer and more considered. Memories folded into commentary, observations scattered like stones across a shoreline. She read of childhood days in the Markham house, of afternoons spent watching her father through the garden window as he drafted architectural plans, of a sister who always seemed one step ahead but never quite present. There were sections on her early poems, the burden of praise, the silence that followed a failed engagement. Jessica paused at that, surprised. Helen had never mentioned such a thing before, and then the entries grew more recent. The tone shifted, the warmth dulled, names were hinted at, though rarely written in full. Jessica noted one recurring figure, referred to only as another entry simply began. "He returned I knew he would. The voice on the page was no longer reflective. It was alert, wary. Jessica closed the notebook gently, the weight of it heavier than its size. This wasn't a memoir for admiration. It was a record of being watched. She opened the second notebook carefully, noticing a difference before reading a single line. Small tears at the spine, edges feathered unevenly. Some pages had been removed. Not ripped, but lifted precisely, as if by someone who had time and motive. Jessica turned to the middle, where the thread of Helen's handwriting picked up again mid-sentence. But I never confronted her. I wasn't sure if it would help or simply drive her deeper into her story. Doris always needed to be right, even when it meant being cruel. Doris, Helen's sister. Jessica had only heard her name once before, in a brief mention of estrangement. She scanned further. Another page gone. Then another. On the next surviving page, a paragraph ended with a half-sentence and a trailing dash. I told M that the letters were hidden, and he. Jessica's eyes narrowed. M had Miles known. The redactions were deliberate. Someone had tried to erase not just the contents, but the connections. But they hadn't counted on the emotional residue left behind. The tone of the surrounding pages was tense, conflicted, interrupted, like a voice being silenced just before speaking aloud. She reached the final entry. Only 4 lines. If you're reading this, then I was too late, or you were too early. Either way, I hope you ask the right person, because I can't say his name anymore. Jessica stared at the final word, anymore, and felt the weight of someone who had once tried, and perhaps had failed. Jessica opened the third notebook with the same care she might give to a broken heirloom. This volume was thinner, less structured, pages filled sporadically, as if written in moments of stolen courage. Near the center, she found a passage underlined 3 times in blue pencil. I am not safe in my own story. The sentence stood alone, followed by a space, and then a new entry in darker ink. It's a strange thing, to live among people who smile at you and slowly unwrite you behind your back. I hear conversations stop when I enter rooms. I find pages I didn't leave open, letters out of sequence. Audrey says I'm overthinking, but she's too calm for someone so observant. Jessica felt her breath catch slightly. I caught R watching from the hall again. He thinks I don't notice, but I do. I always do. I've just learned to let them think I don't. She closed the notebook slowly, her fingertips cold. Helen hadn't simply been lonely. She'd been cornered, in her home, in her mind, in her past. And now it was Jessica's story too, one that someone still wanted unwritten. Jessica stood, the notebooks gathered neatly in her hands, when a faint creak on the landing made her glance toward the open doorway. Miles Haverly stood just outside the threshold, his posture still, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, with a calm that felt studied, he asked, "Looking for something, Mrs. Fletcher?" Jessica met his gaze. "I was retrieving my glasses. Audrey was kind enough to let me in." His eyes dropped to the stack of notebooks. "Those belong to Helen," he said. "I imagine many things in this house do." He stepped closer, voice even. She was fond of documenting her thoughts, not always with kindness. Jessica nodded. "Yes, but often with truth." He tilted his head slightly. "Truth is a difficult thing, isn't it? It can be taken out of context, bent, or buried." Jessica replied. A long silence settled between them. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the notebooks. Jessica didn't move. "Not yet." Miles didn't push. He offered a smile, polite, distant, and stepped aside. As Jessica passed him in the narrow hallway, she felt it again, that shift in the air. Not threat, Not quite, but something watching, waiting, quietly rewriting the ending. The request, though phrased casually, landed with weight. "I was wondering," Jessica said, her tone lightly conversational, "whether I might have a look in the attic. Just for a moment. I've always found old storage boxes reveal more about a person than their shelves ever do." Audrey narrowed her eyes. "The attic? I noticed a collection of journals mentioned in Helen's writing, possibly from before her published work, for my own notes." Audrey hesitated, the reluctance plain on her face. "There's nothing up there but dust and broken lamps." Jessica smiled gently. "Still, I wouldn't feel right leaving without trying." Audrey's lips pressed thin. For a moment Jessica thought she might be refused. Then, with a clipped nod, Audrey said, "I'll get the key." The staircase was narrow, creaking with each step. Dust swirled in the angled sunlight filtering through the gable window. Jessica entered slowly, letting her eyes adjust. Stacks of boxes crowded the corners. A broken rocking chair leaned against an old trunk. The room smelled of cedar and time, and something else, memory. Jessica stood still for a moment, her breath measured. She was no longer looking for glasses, or even letters. She was looking for what Helen had never dared name aloud. Jessica moved carefully, not out of fear of disturbing the dust, but out of reverence for what might lie beneath it. The boxes were old, most secured with string, some with brittle brown tape now curling at the edges. She leaned toward the stack nearest the window and studied the handwritten labels. HM 1967, 1971, correspondence, estate records, mother's side. She crouched beside a particularly well-preserved one, marked private, 1985. Its top bore a faded water ring, as though someone had once rested a teacup on it, long ago. The knot on the twine was tight, too tight for casual packing. She reached for a pair of old scissors on the windowsill, nicked the string, and opened the lid with care. Inside were ledgers, journals, a cloth-bound photo album wrapped in tissue. None of it appeared to have been moved in years. And yet something about the arrangement felt too perfect, centered, deliberate, even fragile. Jessica turned over one of the smaller notebooks and found Helen's handwriting again, looping and confident. But it wasn't poetry, it was personal. Jessica felt a weight settle behind her ribs, the beginning of something she hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just Helen's attic. It was a ledger of what she'd never dared speak. Jessica opened the photo album with a caution that bordered on reverence. The first page held a portrait of Helen as a young woman, early 20s, hair pinned back, standing beside a rose trellis in full bloom. She looked happy, but not carefree. Helen had always possessed that stillness, even in youth, the kind that spoke of things already survived. The next page revealed a seaside snapshot, Helen seated on a picnic blanket, laughing. A child, no more than 3, was in her lap, bright-eyed and reaching toward the camera. Beside them sat a man in shirt sleeves, looking off to the left. His face was gentle, his hand resting protectively on the boy's back. But the corner of the photo was torn, just enough to obscure part of the man's profile. Jessica studied it closely. The tear was deliberate, not accidental, smooth along one edge, as though folded and removed with intention. On the reverse someone had written in faded ink, "July, Bellevue Cliffs." No year, no names. She flipped further. The man appeared again once more with Helen and the child, this time indoors, around a modest Christmas tree. His arm circled Helen's shoulders, and though her smile was smaller here, it felt more sincere. Jessica sat back, thoughtful. Helen had written of abandonment, of trust broken, never in detail, but often enough to suggest something unresolved. And here, hidden in tissue and string, was evidence of a chapter never mentioned, a man erased, a child never spoken of, a family Helen never published. Beneath the album lay a slim ledger, its green cloth binding worn at the edges. Jessica lifted it gently, her fingertips brushing over a faint monogram. She opened the cover to find a short dedication, scribbled in Helen's unmistakable hand, for the truth no one else would write. The first page began without preamble. Doris told me I was selfish, that keeping him would ruin everything. But I was already ruined, wasn't I? After Father's will, after the shame that wasn't mine, after the summer where everything was unspoken. Jessica turned the page slowly, her breath measured. The notebook read more like testimony than journal. Tertiary reflective, each entry a fragment of emotion thickened by years of silence. I left for the coast because I couldn't bear the way she looked at me. Like I'd failed at being invisible. Like I'd dared to live where she had only survived. The boy asked once if his name meant something. I lied, I said it came from a book. Jessica's eyes lingered on that line. The boy, he was real, and if Helen's words were to be trusted, he was taken from her, or given up under pressure, from Doris, from the man whose torn image was never meant to be seen. The attic suddenly felt colder, its silence charged. This wasn't family tension. It was a long, quiet war, fought through shame, silence, and survival. And the story Helen never published might have belonged to someone still alive. Jessica's hands remained resting on the final page. Though her eyes had moved beyond the words, she wanted everything for herself. That sentence had come mid-entry, but it rang louder than any that followed. The notebook's last section recounted Doris's arrival at their mother's estate, how she had moved swiftly, calmly folding herself into legal decisions while Helen, overwhelmed and quiet, found herself increasingly erased. She said I was too delicate for confrontation. That poetry didn't build houses. But what she really meant was I talk, and she buries. When I told her I might fight for my name on the papers, she smiled, told me I could write it in a journal, and hide it. Jessica stared at the line, fingers pressing slightly into the paper. The tone wasn't bitter, it was exhausted, a record of defeat more than accusation. If Doris had known about the memoir, or even suspected, her sudden return made unsettling sense. Especially now with Helen gone. Especially now when the past no longer had a voice to speak it aloud. Jessica closed the notebook gently. There was truth here waiting beneath layers of family decorum, and somewhere Doris's version of it. Ready to be defended, Jessica returned the items to their boxes with quiet precision, her thoughts looping steadily through everything she had read. As she tied the twine back around the stack, a memory surfaced, subtle but persistent. Doris had arrived within days of Helen's death. No announcement, no reason given, simply reappeared. The attic, dusty and still, bore no recent signs of disruption. But the redacted pages in Helen's memoir, the photo torn at the edge, the sudden disappearance of the man in every story, they all shared a common shadow. A shadow shaped perhaps by a sister who knew how to disappear people without ever raising her voice. Jessica descended the stairs carefully, the creaking boards beneath her feet sounding less like age and more like quiet warnings. Audrey met her at the bottom, startled to see her reappear so quickly. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Jessica nodded. "Not quite, but I found what someone hoped I wouldn't." Audrey's eyes flickered. "Is that so?" Jessica didn't answer. She stepped outside into the crisp air, where Doris's rental car was still parked, perfectly positioned. too soon for grief, too late for coincidence, and, Jessica suspected, right on time for damage control. The morning light slanted across Helen's study, casting long shadows along the shelves. Jessica stepped quietly into the room, as if not to disturb the memory it still held. On the side table, near the chair where Helen often wrote, sat a porcelain teacup. It was delicate, blue-rimmed, and empty. But what caught Jessica's attention was not the cup itself. It was the faint ring of dried liquid at the base, and the way the spoon lay askew on the saucer, untouched since it was placed. Jessica turned toward the hall and called gently. "Audrey?" The housekeeper appeared, cautious as ever. "Yes? May I ask when Helen last had tea here?" Audrey's brow furrowed slightly. "That morning? Before I found her." Jessica walked slowly to the cup. "It's cold, as if it was poured, but never sipped." Audrey glanced at it, then quickly looked away. She didn't always drink it. Sometimes she forgot. Jessica studied her, or something interrupted her. Audrey didn't answer. The untouched teacup, the still room, and the silence that lingered, they all suggested a moment paused. A life halted not in chaos, but in decision. And Jessica felt the weight of that silence deepen. Audrey remained near the doorframe, her hands clasped tightly in front of her apron, knuckles slightly white. Jessica spoke softly. "Tell me about that morning." Audrey exhaled, slow and deliberate. She rose earlier than usual. She hadn't been sleeping well, but that day, she looked rested, calm, even. Jessica nodded for her to continue. "She had her tea set out already when I came in, said she didn't need breakfast, just wanted to sit. She was looking out the window. Did she say anything unusual?" Audrey's lips tightened. "She asked about the fog, whether I thought it would lift." Jessica waited. She said it like it mattered somehow, not in a casual way. Audrey stepped further into the room, and then she smiled, not forced, but final, like someone who had reached the end of something and made peace with it. Jessica watched her carefully. "Did that worry you?" I didn't know what to make of it. Helen could be moody, but that morning wasn't mood. It was conclusion. The air between them shifted. Jessica now saw not just grief in Audrey's face, but something more complex. Recognition. Perhaps even complicity. Helen hadn't panicked that morning. She had chosen a kind of stillness. Jessica let the quiet hang for a few seconds longer, then asked gently, "Audrey, did Helen ever tell you she was afraid of someone?" Audrey blinked. "Afraid?" "Yes, not vaguely unsettled, truly afraid." The older woman hesitated. Her eyes dropped, then lifted again. "Once, just once." Jessica's voice lowered. "When was that?" "Last fall. There was a letter she received, hand-delivered. No return address. She read it, said nothing at first. Then later that day she asked me to check the locks. Did you see the letter? She burned it in the fireplace before I had the chance." Jessica's thoughts stirred, and after that she became quieter. Not visibly frightened, not exactly, but she began hiding things. Her drafts, her notes, she'd move them around, check them twice. Sometimes she'd ask if I heard someone walking upstairs, but there was no one. Jessica nodded slowly. "And she never mentioned who the letter might have been from?" "No." Audrey's voice was faint now, but she stopped writing for 2 weeks afterward. Jessica folded her hands. "Sometimes fear doesn't come in the form of threats. Sometimes it arrives in handwriting, or silence." Audrey's lips parted, as if to speak, then closed again. Some truths were still held too tightly. The fire in the study hearth had long gone cold, but Jessica could almost imagine Helen there, her shawl wrapped over her shoulders, pen in hand, eyes focused on something only she could see. "She said something to me the night before. Audrey offered suddenly. I wasn't going to mention it. Jessica turned to her, gently attentive. She said she'd written the last page. Jessica stilled. Of what? I assumed her memoir, Audrey said. She didn't elaborate, just said it was finished now, and that she hoped someone would understand. Jessica's brow furrowed. She said that exactly. Someone will understand. Eventually, that's what she said. Jessica nodded slowly. But the manuscript wasn't complete. Audrey looked away. Pages were missing, Jessica continued. Sections removed, names left blank. She called it finished, but something was still being concealed. Audrey's voice softened. Maybe she meant the part she could write. Maybe the rest wasn't hers to tell. Jessica looked again at the fireplace, where so many unspoken things may have disappeared in quiet flame. The truth, she thought, often lived in what wasn't written, and Helen may have considered omission a final kindness, or a final shield. Either way, she believed the story had ended. Jessica stood quietly, letting the pieces settle into place. The letter, the fear, the calmness, the final page. She didn't seem hopeless, Audrey. She seemed resolved. Audrey nodded slowly. Yes, that's what frightened me most. Jessica turned toward the window, her voice low. She may have ended her life, but not to escape despair. She ended it to preserve something. Audrey's breath caught. Someone? Jessica prompted gently. Audrey didn't reply right away. Then almost inaudibly, she said, there were things she couldn't say, but she was trying to protect someone. I knew that. Jessica turned to her. From what? Shame? Exposure? I think, both, and maybe guilt. Audrey's hands twisted in her apron. I begged her to wait, told her stories don't have to end on the last page. Jessica looked at her with quiet intensity, and yet she believed this one did. Audrey met her gaze, sorrow etched into every line of her face. I think she thought her silence would protect them all, that by not naming them, she was setting them free. Jessica felt the weight of that. Freedom bought with finality, mercy written in ink that would never dry, and somewhere behind it, a secret still carefully folded. Jessica walked slowly along the hallway, her thoughts folding in on themselves like pages pressed too tightly shut. Outside, the wind stirred the curtains, bringing with it the faint scent of salt and rosemary. Helen had died with secrets intact, some buried, some burned, some bound in half-written phrases. She had orchestrated her silence with intention, perhaps even with love. But love could suffocate too. Jessica paused near the window, letting her gaze settle on the garden below. Audrey had returned to the kitchen, but her presence lingered, a woman carrying loyalty like a burden she didn't know how to set down. Jessica opened her notebook and wrote a single line. There is a difference between protecting someone and erasing the truth to protect yourself. She underlined it once, then closed the cover. Somewhere in the spaces between Helen's quiet gestures, a line had been crossed, whether by Helen herself or by someone she sought to shield. Jessica didn't yet know. But the story was not over. It was simply paused, waiting for the last hand to be revealed, and in Gull's reach, the past didn't rest. It watched and waited to be named. Jessica sat by the window in her room at the inn. Helen's unfinished memoir spread across her lap like a fragile confession. The late afternoon light glinted off the ink, turning the page edges gold. She turned again to the section that bore only dates. No names, no entries, just conspicuous absences where the narrative should have flowed. 3 dates, precisely spaced. Jessica opened her notebook and cross-referenced the entries against the community calendar she'd copied at the town library. Her brow furrowed. All three corresponded with Doris's documented visits to Gull's Reach, once for a local historical society lecture, once for a brief vacation, and once, quietly and without announcement, after a sudden departure from a university event. Each time Helen had stopped writing, each time she had erased something. It wasn't a lapse of memory, it was a deliberate omission. Jessica ran her finger along the uneven edge, where pages had been cleanly removed. Not torn, removed, by someone careful, not to deceive, but to shield. Helen had been telling a story, then had chosen silence when it intersected with Doris's world. Jessica closed the memoir gently. It was what Helen hadn't written that told the clearest truth. Doris greeted Jessica at her front door with a faint smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "Jessica, I was wondering when you'd come." Jessica accepted the invitation inside with a quiet nod. The house smelled faintly of lavender and old books, and there was a slight tension in the air, as though the furniture itself were bracing for impact. "I've been reading Helen's manuscript," Jessica said as they settled in the sitting room, or what's left of it. Doris stiffened. "There are sections missing," Jessica continued gently, "each coinciding with your visits here, including the summer Helen mentioned a child never named." Doris looked away. "I'm not here to accuse," Jessica said softly, "only to understand." A long silence stretched between them. Then Doris spoke, her voice quiet, as if afraid the walls might remember. "She was never supposed to write it down." Jessica's gaze didn't waver. "She said she wouldn't, that she'd protect everyone." Jessica leaned forward just slightly, but someone didn't want the truth to rest quietly. That's why the pages were removed. To keep that promise. To keep you out of it. Doris's lips trembled. Secrets, Jessica thought, never truly die. They just wait for the right silence to break. Doris stood abruptly, walking toward the mantel, where a faded portrait of their parents hung stern and unsmiling. Her voice, when it came, was brittle. "She was always stronger than me. Not louder, not bolder, just stronger." Jessica waited, letting the moment unfold. "We were young," Doris began. She had just turned 20. There was a man. He was older, charming, foolish. It ended quickly, but the consequences... Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for a glass of water, untouched. She couldn't keep the baby. Not here. Not then. Our parents would have. She stopped herself. She was sent away. The child adopted in another state. Miles Haverly's name wasn't even real at first. It was chosen later. By them. Jessica felt the shift. The heaviness of truth finally exhaled. She never told him. No. She wrote him letters, I think. But she never mailed them. Jessica recalled the drawer of unsent correspondence, the handwriting pressed down, urgent, aching, and the manuscript. Jessica asked. Doris nodded, ashamed. She told me she'd written everything down, but that she'd never name names. She said, "You have your life, and I won't be the reason it's taken from you." Tears gathered at the corners of Doris's eyes. "I let her do it. I let her carry it alone." Jessica's voice was barely above a whisper. "You didn't just let her, you asked her to." The truth, once spoken, hung in the room, heavy, and far too late to be undone. Later that evening, Jessica returned to her room, opened her notebook, and laid the faded photograph she had taken from Helen's attic on the desk. Helen, younger and smiling, held a small child in her arms. Beside her stood a man with a quiet, closed expression, dark eyes, thoughtful mouth, hands folded with awkward gentleness. It had taken only a short glance through the town's public archives to match the adult face, Miles Haverly. the quiet man who had appeared in Helen's hall and vanished just as easily. Jessica stared at the photograph again. Not a friend, not a tenant, a son. She recalled the barely concealed sorrow in Helen's final writings, the repeated allusions to a truth that could not be written, only carried. Miles didn't know, or if he did, he had buried it deeply enough to convince himself otherwise. Jessica tapped the corner of the image. There was no inscription, no date, no handwritten clue, only faces frozen in time, love veiled as secrecy, and the sense that Helen had lived her last years not in fear of being discovered, but in fear of what her discovery might undo. There were stories people wrote, and there were stories they chose to leave untold. The kitchen at Helen's house was quiet when Jessica returned. Audrey was folding linens by the window, her movements slow, methodical. Jessica approached gently. "Did she ask you to destroy the missing pages?" Audrey's hands paused. "She did." Jessica waited. "She brought them to me in a bundle, handwritten sheets, ribbon-tied. Said, 'These are for the fire. They contain the truth I promised I wouldn't tell.'" Jessica's voice softened. "And you didn't ask what was in them?" Audrey shook her head. "I didn't need to. I saw it in her face. She wasn't afraid for herself. She was protecting someone else." "Doris," Audrey nodded, "and Miles, though I don't think he ever truly knew." Jessica folded her arms gently. "That truth could have reshaped a family, or broken one," Audrey replied. Helen believed in words, but she also knew when not to speak them. Jessica looked toward the empty study. She loved them both. Audrey's voice caught, "Yes," enough to disappear behind their futures. Jessica took a breath, deeply moved. "It wasn't cowardice." "No," Audrey said. "It was the only kind of bravery she had left." And in that quiet kitchen, with the sun falling across the floor, Jessica understood the mercy that comes with omission. Jessica walked once more along the shore near Gull's Reach, the wind gentle, the sea murmuring secrets it would never betray. Helen's absence was everywhere, in the house, in the town, in the silences that now meant something deeper. She paused, watching a gull circle overhead, before veering off toward the cliffs. Helen had called out across time in ink and pauses, and things left unsaid. Jessica had arrived too late to answer, or perhaps just in time to listen. She opened her notebook and wrote one final line. "Some friendships end with a goodbye, others with a silence we only learn to hear once it's gone." And for the first time since arriving, Jessica felt the mystery wasn't in how Helen died. It was in how deeply she had lived, and how much she had dared to protect. The cost of that silence, Jessica knew now, was love, and love had never come cheap. The sun had just begun its descent beyond the cypress trees, as Jessica stood at the edge of Helen's garden. Audrey joined her quietly, her apron loosened, sleeves rolled, a weariness in her eyes that went beyond the day's chores. "She was tired," Audrey said softly. "But not of living, just tired of pretending." Jessica nodded, her gaze resting on the distant hills. "I don't think she ever forgave herself," Audrey went on, "for what she kept, for what she gave up." There was no accusation in her voice, only the hollow echo of long-kept sorrow. "I promised her I'd say nothing, that I'd let her story end the way she wanted it to." Jessica turned, her voice gentle. "That's no small burden." Audrey met her eyes. "I loved her like a sister, but some nights I wonder if I should have begged her to tell the truth instead." Jessica didn't answer right away. Instead, she watched the light slip through the leaves like a final whisper. "You honored what she asked," Jessica said. "And sometimes, that is the loneliest kind of love." They stood in silence as the last of the daylight faded, and in that fading, A truth neither could quite name lingered. Later that evening, Jessica sat at the desk in her room, fingers resting on the spine of Helen's memoir. The pages, still soft with the weight of grief, remained open, but unread now. She had seen the resemblance in Miles's eyes, the way he spoke of poetry with reverence he couldn't quite explain. But Jessica also saw the life he'd built, modest, honest, unknowing. To tell him now, to untangle a lineage that Helen had spent her life guarding, would not bring peace. It would only scatter questions into a past no longer answerable. She reached for the letter she had started, the one addressed not to Helen, but to Miles. She held it in her hands a long while, then folded it slowly, and tucked it away in her notebook. Some truths, Jessica had come to learn, were like stones in a stream, solid, unmoving, but softened by time and current. You didn't remove them, you simply stepped around them and carried on. She turned down the lamp, letting darkness settle gently across the room. There was nothing more to be said, at least, not to the living. Jessica uncapped her fountain pen, and smoothed a fresh sheet of paper. The words came slowly at first, halting, as if unsure they deserved the page. "Dear Helen," she began, "I wish I'd come sooner. I wish we'd had one last walk, one last pot of tea. 1 hour where silence didn't sit between us like a closed book." She paused, feeling the sting behind her eyes. "I've pieced together your story, or most of it. There were pages missing, yes, but I believe I've read between the lines." She wrote of Doris, of Miles, of the pain Helen had carried like an heirloom passed down in secret, of the beauty in her restraint and the tragedy in her love. "You once told me that every story ends with a choice, to speak or to remain silent. You chose silence, but you did it out of love, and now I choose to understand." Jessica signed her name with trembling grace, then folded the letter slowly, smoothing the creases with her palm. She would not post it. This was not a letter meant for the postal service. It was meant for peace. The morning mist had given way to the crisp gold of mid-morning as Jessica walked the winding trail toward the cemetery. A narrow footpath, once a lane for carriages, led her through a field of wild lavender and pale blue aster. The scent hung in the air, delicate, honest, and deeply familiar. Jessica remembered summers spent in Helen's childhood garden, hands stained with juice from wild berries, laughter bright and untroubled. Those were the days before secrets, before silence grew roots in the heart. She passed the stone wall and paused at the gate. It creaked gently, like the sigh of someone remembering. Helen's grave sat near the western edge, modest, surrounded by faded blooms and the occasional pine cone left by wind or child. Jessica knelt, the letter in her hand, her eyes on the etched name. Helen Margaret Voss, the stone read. Beneath it, a simple line: she lived gently. She loved fiercely. Jessica smiled faintly. It wasn't the whole story, but perhaps it was enough. She brushed away a leaf that had settled at the base, and for a moment she thought she heard the soft hush of Helen's laughter in the breeze. She let the silence embrace her. Jessica placed the folded letter beneath a small, smooth stone by the grave, not hidden, but not calling attention to itself either. Like the secrets Helen had kept, it would rest quietly, asking nothing. She rose slowly, brushing the dirt from her skirt, and stood in stillness. There were no grand conclusions today, no satisfying verdict, only a life unraveled with care, then stitched again with absence. She thought of Miles, walking the bookshop aisles unaware, of Doris standing beside her success, built on the cost of someone else's silence, of Audrey forever holding her promise like a stone in her chest, and she thought of herself, the friend who arrived too late for answers, but just in time for understanding, was justice served. Jessica could not say. Justice had not been Helen's goal. Protection had been. Dignity. Love bent and bruised but unbroken. As Jessica turned to leave, the sun broke through the lavender clouds, lighting the path home. Some farewells were loud, full of tears and final words, but others lived in the hush between heartbeats, soft, unresolved, and sacred. Jessica walked on, the scent of lavender clinging to her coat, and the story at last let go. In the end, some stories are not solved so much as softly folded away, like a letter never sent, resting beneath wild lavender, where memory and mercy quietly meet. But tell me, was Helen's silence a final act of love, or the last defense of a truth too fragile to bear? I'd love to know what you think. Share your thoughts or theories in the comments below. And if this mystery moved you, feel free to like the video, share it with a fellow mystery lover, and subscribe for more stories where the heart and the truth are never too far apart.